Okay, so if you're watching the recording, welcome. This is the December 6th session of the Manhattan GMAT Study Hall. We've just gone over the rules, and today the topic is more on sentence structure issues overall in sentence correction. So again, just a brief reminder, when you get a multiple choice question, please use these options. Find the multiple choice options in there. Do not post in the chat box. Thank you very much. And these problems are from the GMAT Prep software. So that's free software. We're allowed to distribute the problems because they are free. We're not allowed to use problems from the official guide. Just make sure that you know that you should not be distributing those either. But the official guide problems. On the other hand, the GMAT Prep problems, which are free, are also free to distribute because they are free. Okay, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat box. If not, we are going to go ahead and pick some problems and start looking at them. Okay. No one's got any questions. All right, here's the first problem for today. It's a longer problem. Remember, when you see longer problems, that means it's okay to take more time on them than the average. So I'll give you a clock here. Here's a clock. Go for it. Okay, there's still a lot of people without answers here. So please pick something if you haven't already. Give you a few more seconds here to do that. Just remember that when you take the test, there's no such thing as not answering the problem. So you got to pick something. Okay, let's take a look. So here are your answers as a group. Here's your, so there's still a couple of non-responses, not a lot. So we got a majority in favor of choice B here. Let's take a look, and remember that the theme of today's class is overall sentence structure. So what we want to focus on is that. And what I mean by overall sentence structure is two things. When we say we're talking about overall structure of a sentence, it means just basically making sure that the whole sentence is actually a complete sentence. So there are two kinds of ways that this doesn't happen, and those are known as fragments and run-on sentences. I mean, there are a few different kinds of each of those, but the issues that you have here, one issue that you have is a fragment, which means you don't have a complete sentence. It means you just have a piece of it. What you have is not a whole sentence, but just a piece of one. Or a run-on sentence, which means you have too many elements in it. Like you actually have too much stuff to have a complete sentence. So I mean, we'll see more of this as we go. But, you know, there's a certain balance of elements that you have to have a sentence. You have to have a subject and a verb. Sometimes you have an object, sometimes you don't. But you basically have to have a subject and a verb. And then usually you have a whole bunch of modifiers hanging out too. But that's your basic structure. So let's talk about what's going on with some of these choices. In particular, a distinction that you need to learn to make if you don't already know how, you need to learn the distinction between modifiers and essential sentence elements. And what I mean by essential, I just made that term up. That's not really a term. But I mean the things that make the core of a sentence. And I mean, remember that the core structure of a sentence is subject, verb, and sometimes object. So you need to learn to distinguish between things that are modifiers and things that are essential sentence elements. So I think I made a sentence something like this the last time we did this topic in a study hall, but here's an example again. The dog fell. The dog fell is a sentence. I mean, it's actually a complete sentence. It's a subject and a verb. It doesn't need an object. So, but then you can add a whole bunch of other modifiers to it, and you still have a sentence, like you can add the word cute. Adjectives are modifiers. The cute dog fell. The cute dog that we adopted. The cute dog that we adopted last Friday, in the afternoon, at the shelter, down the street, fell down the stairs, onto the floor, with a loud thud, comma, scaring the baby. And you can even have modifiers that come before. The sentence doesn't have to start with a subject. So something like unaccustomed to the indoors. And then in that case, I guess you wouldn't capitalize. So there. I mean, notice that you still have a core sentence of the dog fell. That's your subject and your verb. And then every single other thing in here is a modifier. And when you're looking at the structure of a sentence, you have to learn to ignore the things that are modifiers, because grammatically those don't change your overall structure. They're just extra description. In terms of the meaning, they're going to be important. I mean, if something is there as an additional description, it's probably there for a reason. But in terms of the overall grammatical function of the sentence, the modifiers are not a thing. So that sort of thing. So let's take a look at these choices and see what in them is modifiers and what in them isn't. So modifiers in that color. Let's take a look at some things that are modifiers. So constructed at least as early as the Sui dynasty, comma, that's just a description of whatever comes after it. And then comma, more than 1,000 years older than a similar one in Beijing. That's just a modifier. Constructed at least as early as that time is still a modifier. Comma, the oldest known altar used in Chinese state religious practice. That's just a noun describing another noun. And then here's a modifier, comma, ing. And it's two modifiers connected by and, which makes it just one big modifier. Comma, which. It's a big, gigantic modifier starting with comma, which. And comma, more than 1,000 years older than a similar one in Beijing. It's also a modifier. Then, here's two opening modifiers in front of the altar of heaven. And then you got comma, which was constructed at least as early as this dynasty. And so which does this and is this. So let's look at what we have left over when we do that. Because remember, when you take the modifiers out of the sentence, what you have to have left is a sentence. It has to be like this. Like when you take out all of the things that are orange or whatever you want to call that color here, then what's left is the dog fell, which is definitely a sentence. So that's what you're trying to do here. You're trying to take out things that are modifiers and make sure the thing you have left is a sentence. Okay, well, let's see what we've got when we do that. So let's take those away. All right, modifiers are purple. Let's see what's left over once we take those out. Well, the first sentence we have, the altar of heaven is the oldest known altar used in state religious practice of China, comma, it is blah, 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 blah. Does anybody want to tell me what is going on there? What is that? Just leave that question vague and see if anybody has thoughts to share about it. Yeah, it's a run-on sentence, right? It's trying to make two sentences in a row with just a comma in between, and you're not allowed to do that. I mean, if you're going to have two sentences, you have to connect them with some sort of connector, like an and or a semicolon or something like that, right? So A winds up being complete sentence plus comma plus another complete sentence. This is a run-on. It's too much stuff. It's too much of a good thing here. Like we got two subject and two verbs. So not okay. So this is one way that you can have a run-on sentence, is if you actually just try to stick two sentences together without any sort of connector. So, I mean, you can, of course, lots of sentences do stick clauses together. But if you want to do this sort of thing, you need a connector such as and or a semicolon or any of those other connectors, you know, but, yet, any of those things. Choice B, let's take a look at what's going on there. Well, the altar of heaven is more than 1,000 years older than a similar one in Beijing, and also is this. The altar of heaven is this and is that. That's totally a sentence. So B is a legitimate sentence. So we'll talk about that pronoun question in a second. Let's make sure we stick to this topic real quick. But we'll get there. Choice C, we are left with the altar of heaven is more than 1,000 years older than a similar one in Beijing, and the only altar found so far. So that's interesting. Like if you write that out without all the noise in the way, you get this. You get the altar of heaven is more than 1,000 years older than a similar one, and the only altar so far that does blah, 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 blah. The problem here is that the way this is constructed, it doesn't really, I mean, it's a sentence. It doesn't have an overall sentence structure issue. But if you look at the way that it's pieced together, the apparent parallel structure is this one. And that's not what's intended here. Like, it looks like it's more than 1,000 years older than two things, which are a similar one and then the only altar that is from before the Qing dynasty. Not the intention. Like, you're trying to say that this altar is the only one. And I mean, you can tell that, actually. You don't have to know Chinese history to figure this out, because if you read the sentence, this author is from 581 to 618. So that's way before these dates. So the only way this sentence could actually make sense is if the only author that predates this dynasty is that one. So that's how you know that C doesn't make any sense. So C is a sentence. It's just not a reasonable sentence. D, let's take a look at what we've got there. The author of heaven and is the only author so far. Well, that's not a sentence, right? So it's missing a verb. You got to connect another verb to is. And then E, blah, 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 the author of heaven, blah, 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 the only author found so far that predates the King Dynasty. There's no verbs in that sense at all. So those are fragments, D and E. They're not sentences. So the question is, how do you know that you're dealing with this kind of thing? So we want choice B. How do you know this kind of thing is an issue? Well, again, it all comes down to splits. Because remember that there's a lot of stuff that you could look at in sentence correction problems, which means there's not really any good reason why you should ever be looking at things that are not splits. Like, there's enough splits in the world, basically, that anything that's not a split doesn't deserve your attention. So if you look at what's split here, well, notice that like this, is more than would be a sentence element. That'd be a verb. Comma, more than this many years older, is just a modifier. If you have a split like that, they can't both work. Because remember that modifiers are things that can get taken out of the sentence. And core elements can't. So if you see this kind of split where some things are modifiers and some things are not modifiers, then you should think of this issue of, how's the overall sentence structured here? So let's take a look at that. If you see a split between core elements, which means subject or verb, that's supposed to be a comma, we'll fix that in a second, and modifiers, then you should consider the overall structure of the sentence, where consider the overall structure means, let's think about whether anything here is a fragment or a run-on. Okay, so we have one question here about pronouns. Let's try to knock that one out real quick here. So it's about choice A, so we can just copy choice A onto the next board. Let's do that. So here's the original choice A. And then there's a question that says this. So you've got the word it. I mean, remember that pronoun ambiguity is a thing that's not even worth considering. Like, there are a lot of pronouns that are technically ambiguous that are still fine. So, like, worrying about this is going to cause you more trouble than it will help. Because the point is that if it's clear what a pronoun refers to, then it's fine. So when you see a pronoun, just check two things. Those are, number one, does it stand for a noun? And again, from the intended meaning of the sentence, you should understand the intended meaning. So it should be pretty straightforward to understand what the pronoun is supposed to stand for. Whether it does stand for that or can stand for that is another issue, but you should at least understand what it is supposed to stand for. And then does it match that noun in terms of singular and plural? Just think about these two things when you see a pronoun. I mean, pronoun ambiguity, not really a thing. I mean, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of pronouns that you could technically call ambiguous because there are multiple nouns or whatever in the sentence, and they're still fine. It's just a matter, I mean, you know, if you had to use every pronoun in a way that was totally grammatically unambiguous, then you would have some pretty serious issues with the language. You know, like in other words, if to use the word "it," if you had to have exactly one singular noun in the whole sentence, then it would be impossible to say a lot of things. That's why we're not very tight about this sort of thing. I mean, when you say ambiguous, if it's unclear what the pronoun stands for, that's a different story. So let me give you an example of when. You know, like if it's actually unclear what the pronoun stands for, then that's an issue. Like as an example, if you say something like Bob talked to Dave about his homework, here we have no idea what his, like this could be either Bob or Dave, and there's absolutely no way to tell who that is. So, but this is not anything that I recall ever seeing on the GMAT, so it's probably not a thing. You're not going to have to worry about it. But you know, to the person who just posted in the box, the only words on this page that you really have to pay that much attention to are these 4 words. Don't worry about this. Really, this is not a joke. You don't have to worry about pronoun ambiguity. Simple. Keep it simple with the pronouns. Noun, yes or no. Match, singular, plural. It's kind of all you have to think about. It's nice. Okay, if you have any other questions about this problem, go ahead and throw them in the box. Otherwise, we'll look at another problem. Let's take a look at this. Try, here's a clock. And don't forget to answer the problems with the multiple choice options. All right, ladies and gentlemen, go ahead and pick an answer if you haven't already. And let's take a look. Okay, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, go ahead and tell me in the chat box, when you first read a sentence correction sentence, what are you looking for? Yeah, what is the message, right? Because, I mean, you don't really know how any of this is supposed to fit together until you know what is going on, like what's the message. So remember, the first thing you look at is what's the message? What is the sentence actually trying to tell us? So, all right, well, we have these British guys saying that, you know, they're saying certain things about using artificial bone instead of more conventional elements. And then as far as showing how their idea would work, like make sure you understand what the point here is. And I mean, Suvik says remove the modifiers. I wouldn't say remove the modifiers, because remember, you might have a sentence that's wrong, and you might have things that are modifiers that like aren't supposed to be. Or you might have things that are not modifying what they should modify. And so, like, I mean, you don't want to take things out when you think about the meaning. Because if it's wrong, then you might be taking the wrong things out. So, I mean, you just gotta like look at what's there and kind of use common sense about what it might be intended to say here. So, but okay, most of this is pretty straightforward, although let's think about this last part real quick, the whole showing how their idea would work. Like when you get to that, remember to hash this stuff out when you read it. Like, what shows how the idea would work? And make sure you figure this out before you start chasing sentence elements. Someone tell me in the text box, what actually does that? Like what shows how the idea should work? It's the structures that they build, right? All of them, not just the bridge. It's all of the structures they build. So like this idea, all of the structures they built, not just the bridge. So that's going to be a thing, because as you'll see in these choices, there are modifiers that don't do what they're supposed to do. But you have to first figure out what they're actually supposed to do. Like the whole idea of what is supposed to modify what is a meaning-based issue. And until you understand what the meaning is actually supposed to be, you can't really get that. So, okay, now let's talk about things that are modifiers and so on. So let's put modifiers in purple, the way that we did on the last problem. Purple modifiers. Purple highlighter, where are you? Okay, you're going to put modifiers in that color here. Notice that comma who say that these things could be easier to design in. Like those are all part of a modifier. You have to make sure that you put stuff back into the sentence and see how it fits into the overall structure. So those are modifiers. And then that's just a verb. That's a sentence. So let's use different colors for these underlines. Let's say that if something is just a verb, let's put it in this color. Versus things that are entire sentences or whatnot. Let's put in that color. Like, you know, the whole clause with a subject and verb. Okay, well, that is a clause. And then the rest of those things are verbs, including their objects and so on. So those are verbs. And then we've got some more modifiers and stuff here. So including a bridge is a modifier, foreshowing is another modifier, which includes a bridge and to show, including a bridge and to show, including a bridge which shows, including a bridge which shows. So, I mean, what you've got here, if you look at these choices, well, let's see if these make any sense. So here you have a pair of architects in Britain and already designed things, like subject and verb. That doesn't work. I mean, you got to have a subject with a verb. You can't have subject alone and verb alone. So this is a fragment. So A is not a thing. If you look at B, a pair of architects in Britain, and that's a sentence. That doesn't work either. I mean, you can't just have this stranded without a verb. You can have a pair of architects in Britain did something, blah, 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 blah. Oh, and they did this too, but not noun and clause. So not a sentence. C, a pair of architects in Britain have already designed a number of structures. That's okay, that's fine. D, a pair of architects in Britain already designed a number of structures. That's fine in terms of being a sentence. The past tense doesn't really make sense here because we are talking about the impact on the present. But at least this is a sentence. And then E, a pair of architects in Britain have already designed a number of structures. So C, D, and E are sentences, but A and B are missing some elements. So A and B are missing some elements. At least C, D, and E are sentences. So now we need to look at things that are not overall sentence structure. Well, let's take a look at these modifiers here. We've already eliminated B, but structures which includes that's definitely not happening. But let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at which shows in choices D and E. Because remember what we did. I mean, we already understand what the meaning is supposed to be when we first read the sentence. And you can't, once you figure out what the intended meaning is, you have to stick to that. I mean, you're not going to be wrong about the intention of the sentence. So consider which shows in choices D and E. Well, what would that be modifying according to, your typical rules for how which works? Like, what is that? It points to the bridge. So that's a problem, right? Like, this would modify the bridge. This describes the bridge. And only the bridge. But that's not the intention, right? I mean, the intention of the sentence is that all of the structures these guys have built are actually supposed to demonstrate their idea. So it's not just the bridge that demonstrates the idea. So choice C doesn't have that flaw, right? Choices D and E are saying that there's a whole bunch of pointless structures, and then there's this bridge that's really cool. But choice C doesn't have that issue. In choice C, they have designed a number of structures to show how their idea could work. So this, to show how their idea should work, is that tells you the purpose of whatever action we've just got done talking about. So how can you tell what? John, I don't know how to say the name there. Someone's saying, how can you tell? Well, you got to read the sentence when you first read it, and there is a certain common sense element involved here. I mean, if they're talking about, the sentence is about a pair of architects in England who are trying to demonstrate this idea. The whole sentence is about this idea. So it just wouldn't make sense if you had a bunch of structures that they're describing for no reason, and then there was one thing that demonstrated their idea. That would just be a nonsense sentence. The ideas would not work. So, but yeah, when you interpret these sentences, make sure you understand, the sentence as a whole thing. The sentence has to actually make sense. The idea has to work. So here, if it were just a bridge that shows how the idea would work, then there would be no point in discussing the other discussing the other structures. It would be a weirdo sentence because we would be talking about a bunch of structures that we don't care about. It would be nonsense. So, let's see. Okay. Let's look at other things that people are asking about here. Get a new. Let's get this thing on a fresh new page and talk about this. Questions that you guys are asking here. So, okay, here's the problem again, and then a couple of you guys are asking questions about it. So it'll show up on your board here in a sec. All right. So you'll see it soon. Someone is asking this. So the correct answer to this thing is C. So remember how parallelism works, right? As long as you can find the elements that you want, and as long as the things marked off by parallel elements are there. So C, to design and build. So that's a parallel structure. You just got to take the things that are parallel here, which are design and build. So, I mean, remember how this works. Here's the, 30-second summary of this. Remember that if there's not a parallel marker in front of something, then you can just take whatever you want and call it part of the structure. So here are 6 different sentences. I like to swim and, well, here are a few different sentences. I like to swim and run. I like to swim and to run. I like to both to swim and run. I like both to swim and to run. Okay, well, so the bottom two is, Jason, is probably what you're thinking about when you ask this question. Because the bottom two actually have markers. They have both and they have and. So then the things after those have to match. Like here you don't have any freedom in what you can pick. So this is to swim and this is run, which makes that one incorrect. But this is to swim and that's to run, so that's actually fine. On the other hand, in the first two, you just have an and. It's the same thing you have over here with design and build. This is just and. That means that the right-hand structure is for sure whatever is there, but you can just pick whatever your left-hand structure is that works with that. So this is run. There's no word like both over here bossing you around, so you can just say what would be parallel to run? Well, swim would. So this structure is swim and run. Here, this is definitely to run. There's no word both hanging out over there, so you can just pick whatever out of all this stuff would be parallel. So I like to swim and to run. So it's not a trap. I mean, there's nothing here that is a trap. It's just what is parallel and what is not. So, I mean, just make sure you understand it. If you're thinking of this as a trap, then there's something not quite right about the way that you're thinking about it, because there is definitely nothing here that is a trick or a trap of any kind. So just make sure you get that. It wouldn't be wrong if you said to design and to build, but you just don't need it. Okay, someone says, Santa says, Santa, it's December. The subject verb agreement, yeah, that's right. We actually mentioned that already, but that is a thing, the subject verb agreement. And then here's this question. Whoever posted this, go ahead and elaborate. I mean, it should be clear to you that this is not an idiom. I mean, this is not what single idioms ever look like. I mean, remember that single idioms are just like, pairs of words that go together, like between this and that. Or like, I replaced this with that. I mean, just looking at this, it should be clear to you that this is not an idiom. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean you need to look at a bunch of idioms and internalize a little bit better what they look like. Because there are definitely no idioms in the world of English that look like this. So, I mean, when you look at this, what I'm saying is that it should be clear to you that these are pieces of a couple of different structures. And if that's not clear to you, then you've got to spend some more time just looking at the way that stuff is put together in English and what it looks like in general. So make sure you understand the general look of the language. Like, what do single elements look like? What do idioms look like, etc. Because, I mean, you really have to be fast at separating, like, single thoughts from other single thoughts. If that takes a lot of time, then before you start looking at a bunch of specifics, your job is going to be to just look over the language and get more used to it. So, which choice is this from? This is from, help me out here, which choice is this in? Peter, this is your question. What choice is this from? Okay, Peter is not there anymore. Okay, it's in choice E. Well, it would be a parallel structure, right? Like whenever you have a than, you're looking at some kind of comparison, and comparisons need to have a parallel structure. So there's your giveaway. So this would be a comparison if it worked. And it doesn't work because there's nothing for it to be parallel to. So there's nothing parallel to with conventional structures. So yeah, that's wrong. Okay. Johnny, what choice are you talking about? Are you talking about the correct answer? All of them that have the verb on them. I'm not sure I really understand, but all that you really need to clarify is the correct answer, because I mean we don't need to clarify the incorrect answer. So if you're asking about that, then I mean the verb is have designed. It's not just have. It's have designed. So that tense has some name. I forget what it is, but the verb is to design, and they have designed a number of structures. So if you wanted the core of that sentence, it would be, the core structure of the correct answer is a pair of architects have designed a number of structures, and then everything else is modifiers. So there's your subject. And there's your verb, and there's your object thing that they did the verb to. So there you go. Okay. A number of structures is not a modifier. It's the object of the verb. So, like I hit the ball. The ball is definitely not a modifier. It's what's called the object. It's the thing that I did this to. In this case, it's the thing that they designed. So, alright. So hopefully that's clear. If it's not, go ahead and just ask whatever. If so, let's move on. Okay. If anybody has any other questions. Alright, let's take a look at another one. How about this one? So remember to answer the questions there. Here's a timer. Go for it. Okay. There are a lot of non-answers here, so make sure you pick something. Take 5 more seconds or something, pick an answer if you have a non-response. Remember, this is a test where you have to pick something. So if you haven't picked something, then make sure you do. Okay, let's take a look. Here's your responses. So not a ton of agreement here. It looks like people liked A and C best. But let's see. Let's take a look. So let's take a look at the difference between modifiers and things that are not modifiers. So I guess we'll just keep with the color code that we had in the previous parts. Let's put modifiers in purple. Okay. And by the way, what does a semicolon do? Who can summarize that for me? Semicolon right there. What is that all about? How do those work? What are they? How do they work? What do they do? So, yeah, in other words, it's a lot like a what? You guys are using a lot of big words, but yeah, it separates two sentences. It's like a period. Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing as a period, except for that it is used when there's some relationship. Like the reason to use a semicolon rather than a period is to like announce to your readers, hey guys, there's a relationship here. So that's the point. So the point is that the stuff after the semicolon, I mean the IE, you can ignore that. It's like that is, or here's the example of what we're going to say. Or here's an explanation. So this has to be a sentence starting with they. So conveniently the underline starts exactly where the second sentence should start. So that's nice. They denounce big government. Modifier. And then while supporting is also a modifier. They denounce big government, dash, dash, blah, 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 blah. Things set off by dashes are modifiers. And then but, also a modifier. They denounce big government, they say that, and it has become too much. Wow, there's actually no modifiers in C here at all. This is a modifier saying this, and then comma at the same time doing that. And then blah, blah, blah between two dashes. And then INGs are modifiers. So, and then there's these constructions with, like, you have these connectors. There's a name for them, and I can't really remember what they're called. But like when you have things like even though and while and as and so on, you should know how those work. Like when you have even though or as or although or while or etc. plus a sentence. Make sure you know how these work. Like those go in front of sentences, but they can't stand by themselves. Like they have to be attached to something else that is a sentence. So, I think they're called like subordinating something or other, but it doesn't really matter what they're called. The point is like how do you use them? So let's just look at a couple of examples of that, because again, just being able to use examples is the point. So, even though I left home 30 minutes early, I still arrived at the theater late. So that's how this is a correct sentence. That's how this kind of thing works. Like, this is the sort of construction that we're talking about. This is the connector, even though. That gets followed by a sentence, but then it has to be connected to another sentence. Like, that can't be the sentence by itself. So, and then this is the main sentence, and that's an attachment to the main sentence. So the difference between, I mean, it's kind of like modifiers, but kind of not. And let me explain what I mean by that. Like the way these things work, the way these elements, like they have one thing in common with modifiers, and then they have one thing not in common with modifiers. So like, how do these elements work? Well, so like modifiers, they can't stand alone. Like they have to be attached to a main sentence. So like notice that you couldn't just have a sentence that said, even though I left home 30 minutes early, period. That would not be a thing. Like on the other hand, the main sentence part it totally would be. If you said I still arrived at the theater late, period, that would totally be a sentence. So what these have in common with modifiers is that you cannot use them by themselves. Like if you have this sort of thing, it has to be attached to something. Now what's different between these and modifiers is, unlike modifiers, they don't modify or describe specific words in the main sentence. You know, as long as you have the right kind of overall relationship, the usage is fine. I mean, because the difference here is, like, let me give you another example of what I mean by this. The rules for modifiers are much more strict, because modifiers actually have to point to specific things, whether those are actions or nouns or whatever. So, like, here are a couple of examples of sentences like this. Here are two sentences that basically mean the same thing, or at least try to. So, as I was coming home from school, the wind blew me off my bike, versus coming home from school, the wind blew me off my bike. So notice, these are not both correct. The first one of these is fine, because this is one of those like subordinated sentence thingies. Like this has as, and then it's followed by a complete sentence. And then it's attached to the wind blew me off my bike. It actually works a lot like this one. So this is correct. On the other hand, the difference is that coming home from school is a modifier, and so it has to follow the rules for modifiers. Whereas the as plus a sentence, or the even though plus a sentence, those don't tag specific words, but like this is a modifier. And they have specific things that they have to describe. Like according to modifier rules, it has to describe the noun that comes after it. There are no things like that for the whole sentences that come after as or even though or whatever. Like those just have to have a vague relationship to the rest of it. So like as long as there's some kind of contrast between this and this, if it's even though, like even though this and that, okay, there's contrast, we're fine. As is while this was going on, this happened, that's also fine. On the other hand, coming home from school is a modifier that has to tag a noun. Like it actually has to point to a noun. So, and that's where you wind up with an issue here, because the wind was not coming home from school, I was. So the second sentence here is incorrect. So that's the deal there. That's a brief discussion of those. It's an aside, whatever you're going to call it. So now let's go back to this. So they denounce big government is totally fine, because that's just a sentence. So no problem there. They denounce big government, but modifier. It's not a valid parallel structure. You have but modifier, and there's nothing that could be parallel to that modifier. So that doesn't work. You have not a modifier, but modifier. It's not a parallel structure. So this doesn't fly. If you look at C, there's a sentence. There's another sentence. While that's a sentence. So I mean, this is while they support is like one of those blue things. It's like as I was coming home from school, or even though I left home 30 minutes early. So that's not an issue, but this is a run-on, because what you're left with is you just have two sentences that are stuck to each other. They denounce big government, comma, they say that government is doing too much. That's not a thing. I mean, you would have to connect those with an and or with something else. So this is a run-on sentence. And then D and E have this problem of you don't have a main sentence. Like D is just while they denounce big government, and so is E, basically. The problem with those two is that they're sort of like just saying, even though I left home 30 minutes early, period. Or as I was coming home from school, period. Well, that doesn't work, right? Like these things have to be attached to other sentences, which they denounce big government doesn't. So those don't work either. So the only thing here that has a valid overall structure is A. So we want A. I mean, so again, the clue here is you have the same kind of split that we were looking at on the other problem. Like you have things that are sentences all by themselves versus things that are not sentences all by themselves. That's basically what's going on. And I mean, you can't really have a construction where both of those are fine. I mean, if you need a sentence, then that's what you need. And if you need a non-sentence element, then that's what you need. But you got to just know how the structure works. But again, you're not looking at this cold. Like, you're not looking at these randomly for no reason, because that would be very hard. That would be extra hard because there's this underline in the middle of it breaking everything up. But when you see splits between, like, okay, that's a sentence and that isn't, then you know this is what you have to think about. So all right, we probably have so that's okay, that's not a bad question. While and at the same time. So not really, because there's while is one of those words that doesn't always mean the same thing. So let me show you what I'm talking about. If you like here, they don't mean the same thing at all. So here's the correct, here's the sentence again. Not here, they don't. Because okay, here this is conveniently this is the correct answer, so we can just look at this. Here's the while. Here's the at the same time. So at the same time means at the same time. I mean, that means exactly what it says. What does the while here mean? Does anybody know? Yeah, it means contrast. Because there's two different kinds of while, right? I mean, so just make sure you're aware of this. Like while can be one of two things. The first is, and what you're thinking that it is it's for things that are simultaneous. So if you say, you know, like while driving home from work, I found a big pile of gold bars. Okay, well, great. And then the other thing that while can do is it can indicate contrast. And that's what it's doing here. So if you say like while most of my colleagues work long hours, Mark often goes home at 3 p.m. So this is not a time simultaneous thing. This is like in contrast to most of these other people. This is what Mark does. So that's what's going on here. You have this kind of contrast thingy going on. So, and because there's a contrast between they think that government does too much, but they also want the government to do. I mean, you could actually put, you know, like the idea here is the same as the idea of like but, or even though, or despite that, or even though they say that, they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. That's what's going on there. So it's the other kind of while. Let's see, we can probably knock one more out of these really quick. So let's try to do that so we can find a short one. How about, okay, how about this one? Let's try that. It's shorter, so I'll give you less time on the clock. And then we'll call it a day. All right, ladies and gentlemen, check this out. If you don't have an answer, go ahead and pick one. There's still a lot of you who don't. So you got to pick something. I'll give you about 5 or 10 more seconds. Okay. If you don't have an answer yet, make sure you pick one. There's this Sandeep who doesn't have an answer. There's a couple other people. So pick something, please. Okay, let's take a look. Here are your responses. So we got a plurality for D, although, you know, people are answering a lot of different stuff. Okay, let's talk about these dashes here. And actually, this is just a dash. I mean, when you see it rendered in certain fonts, it'll look like 2 dashes. But there's only a single dash here. Does anybody know what that means? And what do dashes do? I mean, it's like a comma, but commas do a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, dashes, they block off certain types of modifiers. Let me give you the sort of lowdown here on what dashes do. But then what we need to realize is that dashes are not commas, which that sounds like a statement of the dreadfully obvious, but bear with me here. So what do dashes do? Well, they set off descriptions like modifiers and so on. So the question is, so how are they different from commas? Because, I mean, commas do that too. I mean, if you think about what kind of punctuation normally sets off modifiers, well, that's usually commas. So the question that's prompted here is, how is this different from just having your plain old run-of-the-mill commas? Well, there's 3 different ways. The first way is that it's not a grammar. The first way is not a grammar thing. It's dashes can emphasize when something is ironic or surprising. Like, or they can just emphasize something, or point out that, or point out irony, or like unexpectedness. I don't know if unexpectedness is really a word, but so let me give you 2 examples, one with a dash, one without a dash. You say something like, Joe, who grew up in Miami, thinks that winter in San Francisco is cold. Versus Dan Dash, who grew up in Alaska, thinks that winter in San Francisco is cold. So you have the same point in Miami. You don't know he's American. So Miami is really hot all the time, and Alaska is really cold in the winter. So meaning that someone was from Miami, San Francisco has winter. It's easily cool in the winter, but it's certainly cold in a sense. So like if somebody was from Miami, this would be highly expected because Miami is hot. So someone who's from there would be expecting things. On the other hand, from Alaska, there's a lot of San Francisco. This is very weird. So the dash is actually out that it's weird or ironic or unexpected that Dan didn't think with this, and it's not ironic from Joe, which he thinks. So that's what's going on there. This is normal. And what Dan thinks is not normal. This is ironic or unexpected. So in that case, when it comes to the way the sentence works, there's nothing different at all. Okay, that's one thing dashes can do. Another thing dashes can do is they can be unambiguous where commas might, like dashes can clarify sentences in which commas are confusing or ambiguous. Like if you say something like, 3 of my friends, and John, Chris, and Ryan, and their wives came to the party. Versus if you say something like 3 of my friends, dash, John, Chris, and Ryan, and their wives came to the party. So the problem with the first of these sentences is we're not really sure how many people came. Because it kind of sounds like it could be 3 people who are named John, Chris, and Ryan, and then their 3 wives. Or it could be 3 of my friends and John and Chris and Ryan, and then all 6 of their wives. So we don't really know. And maybe it's like 12 people, maybe it's 6. On the other hand, if you have the dashes here, then there's no ambiguity about this at all. It's very clear that John, Chris, and Ryan are my 3 friends. And so the second sentence means definitely 3 guys and their wives. So no problem there, and that's the second reason. And then the third reason you'll see dashes is that they have a greater freedom as far as what they can actually set off. Like dashes can set off entire sentences as description, and commas can't do that. So here's an example. If you say something like, actually there was an example in the other problem. Let me try to find it. It was in one of the wrong answers, but okay, it's this one right here. Like dash, they say that government is doing too much and has become too powerful. I mean, that's actually okay. You could not do this with commas because that's a sentence. But you can do that with dashes. So if you wanted to make another example of something like that, it could be, James is in financial trouble, dash, he has paid his rent late for the last 3 months, dash, but he is still making lots of purchases on his credit card. So meaning, like, this is, you can't do this with commas. Like, this is actually a sentence, but with dashes you can use that as a thing. So that's what dashes do. Now, here's the point. The point is that dashes are not commas. So that's obvious, right? But what I mean by that is that if you open a description with a dash, you would have to close it with another dash, unless it goes all the way to the end of the sentence. So if there's only one dash, then the description runs all the way to the end of the sentence. Like, in other words, you couldn't have this dash here and then have this and then make that a comma. It's not a thing. Like, you either enclose something with dashes or you enclose it with commas, but you have to be consistent. So these all have one dash, which means that the description needs to run all the way to the end of the sentence. So, okay. By the way, this is not an overall sentence structure issue, but there is this split, which should be the first thing you see. So let's make sure we discuss it. Most of the purported health benefits, that's plural. So we don't want cons. All right, now let's look at the rest of this overall structure. So let's start to the right of the dash, because the things to the right of the dash have to be things that make sense. So here you got a parallelism, or at least you're trying to. Let's look at choice. Let's look at modifiers. Let's just do what we did in the previous part. So purple modifiers. Modifiers in purple. Okay. So compounds also found in these things, and then that do that. Compounds that are also found in these things. And whoa, there's a sentence there. Compounds also found in these, and compounds that are found in these things, and that do that. And then compounds also found in those things, and they do that. So those are, in A, you got a modifier there, and B, you got a modifier there. So let's look at our parallel structures. We eliminated A already, but at least it's modifier and other modifier. And D is also modifier and other modifier. Now, though, we got some monkey business going on in these other choices. Like here, these are suddenly like entire sentences. They inhibit. That's a whole sentence, a whole clause, as they call it. So that's parallel structure. That is modifier. And whoa, that's not a modifier anymore. That's actually a whole sentence. That doesn't work. You can't do that. And then same sort of problem with the very last choice. Modifier. And whoa, that's not a modifier anymore. That's actually a sentence. That's not a parallel structure. And then C kind of has the same issue because it's not a whole sentence this time, but it's a verb. And you can't put a modifier in parallel to a verb. So verbs hang parallel to other verbs. So modifier, and then whoa, that's not another modifier. That's a verb. No fly. So it looks like D wins. So, because, I mean, the thing with the dash is, you know, if you look at these examples, you can realize the thing after the dash might be a whole nother sentence, but it also might not. So you don't know with that. But when you look at the stuff that's behind the dash, you still have to have parallel structures that work. So, and here you got modifier, sentence, verb, modifier, sentence. So then you're looking at overall structure issues again. Okay, we're over time. We're going to go ahead and call it a day here. If you have any administrative questions, you can ask those at this point. If not, thank you for attending, and I hope everybody has a peaceful, relaxing holiday season. If you travel, travel safe, and all that. The next study hall is, if I am not wrong, the next study hall is not actually until January. So it's going to be a while, but thank you for coming. I'm going to go ahead and kill the recording at this point. And if you have questions that are of an administrative nature, like, you know, not subject-based questions, not questions about GMAT stuff, but administrative questions, then feel free to ask those. Otherwise, good night and good luck.